One of the greatest opponents of the medieval Catholic Church was undoubtedly heresy. Not only did Catholic clerics fear aberrant preaching would lead their flock away from the saving grace of orthodoxy, but heretical sects presented a very real challenge to the temporal power of the Church, subverting its institutions and sacraments, violating its tenets, and depriving it of social, political, and financial influence. Of all the medieval Christian heresies, one of the greatest and hardest to uproot has to have been that of the Cathars, a dualist belief system which denied the Trinity and preached that the earth was the creation of the malevolent God of the Old Testament. Before we continue, I want to be honest with you. This isn't a flashy, fast-paced documentary. If you're expecting new visuals on screen every 10 seconds, I would recommend you to literally turn off the video, because this is not for you. But for those who are here for actual detailed ancient history, let's continue. Cathar holy men and women, for the Cathars believed both to be spiritually equal, travelled about the region known as the Languedoc, spreading their beliefs and finding huge numbers of adherents. It was not long before Catharism aroused the ire of one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe, the papacy. The Holy See was unwilling to tolerate this most blatant challenge to its authority right in the heart of Christendom. When attempts to sway the heretics with preaching failed, the Church unleashed a decades-long wave of bloodshed, first with a full military crusade launched against the Languedoc, and ending with a reign of terror carried out by the feared and hated Inquisition, whose methods have been compared to the great political purges carried out in 20th century dictatorships. The fury unleashed upon the Cathars slowly but inexorably broke the Dualists. Brutalized, persecuted, murdered, they were unable to withstand the decades of oppression meted out by the Church of Rome, eventually succumbing in the early 14th century. Although effectively annihilated, the Cathars had a significant and lasting impact on the fabric of the Languedoc, both socially and physically. Their theology was evidently attractive, their holy men and women well respected. Today we will therefore attempt to answer the question, who were the Cathars? In theological terms, Catharism arguably has its origins in Manichaeism, a system of religious belief originating in 3rd century Persia, which incorporated elements of Christianity, paganism, and Gnosticism. Founded by the prophet Mani, Manichaeism became incredibly popular throughout the 3rd to 7th centuries AD, spreading throughout the Middle East westwards into the Roman Empire and stretching as far east as China. Mani was believed by his followers to have been the final prophet after Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus Christ, incorporating elements of all these respective belief systems. The scope of Mani's synthesis was truly remarkable. He drew upon the ancient Persian dualism of Zoroastrianism, with its eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. From Buddhism he borrowed concepts of reincarnation and the path to enlightenment through renunciation of worldly attachments. From Christianity he took the figure of Jesus as a messenger of divine truth, though reinterpreted through a dualist lens. Famously, St. Augustine of Hippo, the great early Christian scholar and theologian, was himself a Manichaean for 9 years before renouncing the faith to return to the Christian Church. Augustine's later polemics against Manichaeism, informed by his intimate knowledge of the religion, became influential in shaping Christian attitudes toward dualist heresies for centuries to come. Simply put, Manichaeism is a dualistic religion predicated upon a binary opposition between light, characterized as all which is spiritual and holy, and darkness, represented by the physical world which by its very nature is evil and corrupted. It is this dual element of Manichaeism, itself a crucial element of Gnosticism, which formed the basis of Cathar belief. The Manichaean cosmos was envisioned as a battlefield where particles of light, fragments of the divine, had become trapped in the material world of darkness. The human soul was one such fragment, imprisoned in the corrupt flesh. Salvation consisted of recognizing this truth and liberating the divine light within oneself through ascetic practices and esoteric knowledge, or gnosis. These fundamental concepts would echo through centuries of dualist thought, eventually finding expression in the Cathar movement. Despite Roman repressions against Manichaeism beginning in the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, the religion spread rapidly. Even when Manichaeism was effectively stamped out in Roman territory, the dualistic worldview endured, first in the beliefs of the Paulicians, a heretical Christian group who emerged in 7th century Armenia and later in the Balkans with the so-called Bogomils, founded by the Bulgarian priest Bogomil in the mid-10th century. The Paulicians, concentrated in Armenia and eastern Anatolia, represented an important intermediate link in the transmission of dualist ideas from Manichaeism to later medieval heresies. They rejected the Old Testament, denied the real incarnation of Christ, and refused to venerate the cross, viewing it as an instrument of torture rather than a sacred symbol. Byzantine emperors alternately persecuted and utilized the Paulicians, at times resettling them in the Balkans to serve as military colonists, which facilitated the spread of their dualist ideas westward. The Bogomils combined the aforementioned dualistic belief with further radical elements. They did not build churches, instead considering the body to be sacred, and engaged in many acts of ritual cleansing as a result. Despite this focus on the importance of the spirit of the individual, Bogomils still considered any action which heightened a person's individual participation in the temporal world as undesirable. Marriage and the consumption of meat and wine, for example, were discouraged, seen as actions which bring a person closer to the material world and therefore to its creator, the devil himself. Bogomilism spread rapidly through the Byzantine Empire in the 11th and 12th centuries. The sect did in fact share some similarities with Christianity. The medieval church certainly considered Christians to be strangers in the material world, pilgrims on a sojourn away from the kingdom of God to which they would return upon death. However, Bogomilism was an incredibly radical belief system which rejected baptism and the Eucharist. It is not surprising that persecution followed. A prominent Bogomil leader in Constantinople, Basil the Physician, was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake sometime in the 1110s during the reign of Alexios I Komnenos. The account of Basil's trial and execution, preserved by the Byzantine princess and historian Anna Komnene, provides vivid detail about Bogomil beliefs and practices. According to Anna, Basil had spread his heresy for over 50 years before being discovered, converting numerous followers, including members of the imperial court. The Bogomil heresy was not limited to Constantinople either. Northwards and westwards, Bogomilism found adherents in Serbia and beyond. As Bogomilism spread freely up the Balkan Peninsula, it is easy to see how this form of dualism reached northern Italy and spread into southern France. In fact, in 1167 at Saint Felix de Caramont in the Languedoc, a council of Cathars was held and was presided over by the Bogomil Pope Nicetas. It was at this seminal meeting that much of the organisation of the Cathars was supposedly formulated, including the appointment of a number of Cathar bishops. The Council of St. Felix represents a crucial moment in Cathar history. The presence of Nicetas, a Bogomil bishop from Constantinople, demonstrates the direct connection between Eastern dualism and Western heresy. At this council, the Cathar churches were formally organised along territorial lines, with bishops appointed for Albi, Toulouse, Carcassonne and Agen. The council established liturgical practices, defined doctrines, and created administrative structures that would govern Cathar communities for decades to come. Whether the Cathars were directly influenced by the Bogomils themselves, whether they developed as part of a continuum of heretical Christian sects that bloomed across Europe in the High to Late Middle Ages and included proto-Protestant thinkers like Peter Waldo of France, is hard to say. What is clear, however, is that the Cathars' distinctive dualism and world denial would appear to share its roots with the Bogomils of Bulgaria and the Gnostic Manichaeans of late antiquity. The term Cathar most likely comes from the Greek katharos, meaning pure or pure ones, likely a reference to the Cathars' dualistic belief and their view of the temporal world as tainted by evil, or in other words, impure. The word Cathar appears to be a slightly later term, and was apparently not used by the Cathars themselves, but rather by their persecutors in both the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Another term used to denote the Cathars was Albigensians, a reference to the town of Albi, an important centre of Cathar belief in the 12th and 13th centuries, and a conurbation from which the religion spread. It is the town of Albi which also lent its name to the military campaigns which aimed to eradicate the Cathars from southern France, the Albigensian Crusade. Instead, the Cathars themselves seem to have self-identified with an entirely different term, in slightly self-congratulatory fashion. They called themselves bons hommes and bonnes femmes, good men and good women. Alternatively, they also referred to themselves as bons chrétiens, that is, good Christians. Before we embark upon a discussion of Cathar belief, it is important to note that the extent to which the Cathars themselves constituted a unified group with centralized authority and belief system is debated. Add to that the fact that our sources for Cathar doctrine come primarily from Catholic churchmen, who are naturally somewhat biased, and from persecuted Cathars, many of whom were subjected to interrogation by torture, and it is easy to see how we must be wary of any authoritative claims on the nature of Cathar belief. The problem of sources is particularly acute when studying the Cathars. Unlike many medieval movements, the Cathars left behind very few written texts in their own words. The most important surviving Cathar text, the Book of the Two Principles, exists only in fragmentary form. Most of what we know about Cathar theology comes from hostile Catholic sources including inquisitorial records, polemical treatises, and chronicles written by those seeking to justify the crusade against them. However, that there was a strong religious and social community that existed in the Languedoc which may be referred to as Cathar cannot be denied. Such was the strength of this religious and social community that thousands of Cathars preferred to perish rather than renounce their faith. As mentioned, the primary feature of Cathar cosmology was dualism, the belief in two diametrically opposed deities. The first was a benevolent deity, a supreme god typified as good and responsible for all spiritual creation. It is communion with this deity that the Cathars sought. The second was a malevolent god responsible for the creation of the temporal world, which by definition of its association with this malignant deity, was corrupt, tainted, and evil in nature. This deity was known as the Demiurge. the concept of the demiurge has ancient roots in Platonic philosophy and Gnostic thought. In Gnostic systems, the demiurge is typically portrayed as an ignorant or malevolent creator who fashioned the physical universe in imitation of the true spiritual realm, trapping divine sparks within corrupt matter. The Cathars adopted and adapted this concept, making it central to their worldview. The demiurge, as the creator of all physical matter, was also known as Rex Mundi, king of the world. It was the antagonism between these two deities and the resulting fallout from their cosmic skirmishes that explained the occurrences in the spiritual and physical lives of humankind. The Cathars associated the New Testament with the benevolent deity of light. Conversely, the God of the Old Testament, noted for his fire and brimstone approach, was rejected by the Cathars. The work of the chronicler Peter of Vaux-de-Cernay, noted for his relatively objective reporting of Cathar belief in his Historia Albigensis, described the Cathars thus: they attributed the New Testament to the benign God and the Old Testament to the malign God, and rejected the whole of the latter, except for certain passages quoted in the New Testament. They maintained that the author of the Old Testament was a liar. They also called him a murderer because he exterminated the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire and destroyed the world by waters of the flood. This radical rejection of the Old Testament distinguished the Cathars from mainstream Christianity and had profound implications for their theology. The God who created the world in Genesis, who gave the law to Moses, who commanded the Israelites in battle, was not the true God, but rather the evil demiurge. The wrathful acts attributed to Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible were seen as evidence of his malevolent nature, rather than expressions of divine justice. Peter also noted that some Cathars believed the good God had two wives from whom he begot sons and daughters. Others believed that he had two sons who were Christ and Satan. In a similar vein, some Cathars apparently believed that the demiurge had once been the servant of the benevolent God of the spiritual realm, and had rebelled against his master in the creation of the material world. This is what may be called mitigated dualism, that is, the evil was in some way subordinate to good, and had been effectively produced by the good deity. Others believed in a stricter sense of dualism, which may be called absolute dualism, in which the two gods, good and evil, were considered to be dual entities eternal in their nature and wielding an equal amount of power. Let me show you numbers that illustrate these theological variations. Inquisitorial records from the early 13th century suggest that approximately 60 to 70% of Cathars in the Languedoc adhered to some form of mitigated dualism, viewing the evil principle as ultimately subordinate to the good. The remaining 30 to 40% appear to have held absolute dualist beliefs. These proportions varied by region, with absolute dualism more common in areas with stronger connections to Balkan Bogomilism. As human bodies are physical, and therefore the creation of the demiurge, they were seen by Cathars as being tainted. Humans were actually fallen angels, or at least their souls were, the souls of angels cast out from the spiritual realm and condemned to the material world. The aim of the Cathar was therefore to break their link with the earth through renunciation of all things temporal, and in doing so return to the supreme creator. Reincarnation was apparently an aspect of Catharism too. To fail in one's quest to reject the physical world would only result in rebirth and the condemnation to eternal suffering on earth in the form of a multitude of human lives. Like medieval Catholics, the Cathars venerated Jesus Christ. However, unlike Catholics, they rejected the concept of his physical incarnation as well as his resurrection. Instead, the Cathars believed the resurrection of Jesus represented reincarnation, the fate of all humans to linger on the tainted earth. Furthermore, they wholly denied Jesus' physical incarnation on the earth, believing that Jesus was in fact the human form of an angel whose body was an illusory one. This doctrine, known as Docetism, had been condemned as heresy by the early church but found new expression in Cathar thought. If matter was inherently evil, the product of the demiurge, then the true God could never have taken physical form. Christ's body must have been a phantasm, an appearance without substance. His suffering on the cross was therefore not real in a physical sense, but rather a spiritual drama enacted for human understanding. Cathars also notably rejected the idea of the Trinity, that the one God exists in three co-eternal, consubstantial divine persons, God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit, commonly termed the Godhead. For the Cathars, there was only one aspect of the divine deity of good, the supreme God himself. As for Christ, just as there were two opposing gods, so too were there two Christs, who existed separately in the spheres of the spiritual and the physical. According to Peter of Vaux-de-Cernay, the Cathars actually believed the Christ born in Bethlehem and crucified in Jerusalem to be evil, a being who partook of the physical world and took Mary Magdalene as his concubine. The good Christ never existed in the world, instead only existing in the parallel spiritual realm of the benign God. Aside from the incarnation, the resurrection of Christ, and the Trinity, the Cathars also denied other fundamental aspects of Catholicism, namely transubstantiation, the idea that during the Eucharist the bread and wine changes into the blood and body of Christ, purgatory, and confirmation ceremonies. The Catholic Church was rejected wholesale. They say that the Roman Church was a den of thieves and the harlots spoken of in the Book of Revelations. As the material world was identified as evil and corrupt, asceticism, or rejection of the material world, was a marked feature of Catharism. Many Cathars appear to have been pescatarian, refusing to eat cheese, milk, eggs, or meat. It would seem that they considered animals to be the bearers of reincarnated souls, and that they should therefore not be killed or harmed in any way. Fish, however, were exempt from this prohibition. The reasoning behind the fish exemption reveals interesting aspects of medieval biology and theology. Medieval natural philosophers, following Aristotelian tradition, believed that fish were spontaneously generated from water and slime, rather than being born through sexual reproduction. Since they were not products of sexual intercourse, they were not considered to contain reincarnated souls in the same way as mammals and birds. This made them permissible food for ascetic Cathars. This extreme world denial had an obvious catch regarding children and family. Peter of Vaux-de-Cernay notes Cathar who believed that siring children barred one from finding salvation, and for whom child-rearing must have therefore been frowned upon. Rainier Sacconi, a 13th century inquisitor, noted that, also, it is a common opinion of all the Cathars that carnal marriage is always a mortal sin, and that the future punishment of adultery and incest will not be greater than that of lawful matrimony. However, many Cathars clearly did have families. As noted earlier, in one version of Cathar cosmology, the supreme good deity possessed two wives and begat children. Evidently, Cathars adhering to this teaching did have children and believed that it would not prevent them from entering the kingdom of heaven. Despite rejecting the Catholic Church as a corrupt organization tainted by the evils of the temporal earth, The Cathars do appear to have had some form of church organisation of their own, albeit a very loose one. The Cathar Council held in 1167 at Saint-Félix de Caramon, notably attended by the Bogomil Pope, apparently divided Cathar congregations in a similar fashion to the existing Catholic dioceses in the Languedoc, namely the bishoprics of Toulouse, Carcassonne and Agen, added to the already existing bishopric of Albi. Charters were also drawn up for the creation of these churches. Cathar bishops were supported by two officials, the Filius Major and the Filius Minor, and a number of deacons who aided the bishops in their pastoral role. However, beyond the office of bishop, there was no priesthood who existed to act as intermediaries between the people and God. Instead, there was a different kind of twofold division amongst the Cathar faithful: Perfecti and Credent. Perfecti, or perfects, referring to themselves as bon hommes, or bonnes femmes, for women were not barred from becoming perfects either, were in no way clerics. Rather, they were holy men and women of exceptional piety, a piety they generally expressed through extreme asceticism. Perfecti would follow a strict pescatarian diet, refrain from all sexual contact, and practice material renunciation, living lives of extreme poverty. This world denial was intended to break the soul's link to the physical world, allowing the angelic spirit within the Perfecti to escape the cycle of death and rebirth and return to the spiritual realm of the benevolent deity. Let me show you numbers that reveal the dedication required to become a perfect. Historical records suggest that the average perfect consumed approximately 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day, well below the 2,000 to 2,500 calories typical for active adults in medieval society. They owned essentially no personal property, typically possessing only the black robes they wore and perhaps a single copy of scripture. Perfects walked an average of 20 to 30 kilometers per day while preaching, enduring harsh weather and often sleeping outdoors or in simple shelters. Despite having no official role, the Perfecti were viewed with great reverence and respect by the remainder of the Cathar flock, known as credenti or believers. Perfecti would travel throughout Cathar lands, often in pairs and dressed in solemn black robes, ministering to the credents and spreading Cathar teachings. When not travelling, the Perfecti would live in small communities, or even at the courts of nobles. Houses maintained by female Perfecti would often house young Cathar noblewomen, many of whom would go on to become Perfecti themselves. These houses served multiple functions. They were centres of Cathar teaching and worship, refuges for women seeking alternatives to marriage or convent life, and workshops where Perfecti supported themselves through craft production, particularly weaving. The credents would renounce their earthly lives and also join the ranks of the Perfecta when they believed their spiritual journey to be nearing completion. It appears that the other great duty of the Perfecti was to administer the Consolamentum, a ritual unique to the Cathars, a washing away of sins accrued during the time a person spent on the earth. Crucially, it was the ritual of Consolamentum which admitted a Cathar to the rank of the Perfecti, and as such it carried with it enormous spiritual weight. As a world-denying religion without a priesthood, the Cathars had very few sacraments indeed. As we have discussed earlier, they rejected wholesale all the rituals of the Catholic Church such as the Eucharist. Their primary sacrament was known as Consolamentum, carried out by bishops and Perfecti. The 13th century Inquisitor Rainier Sacconi noted that it was alternately called spiritual baptism or baptism of the Holy Spirit. The intention of the ritual was to purge a person of the sins and corruption, which they had accumulated through dwelling on the evil earth, enabling them to draw closer to the benevolent supreme God, and, it was hoped, to return to that realm upon their death. The actual ceremony itself appears to have involved recitation of Scripture, in particular the Lord's Prayer as it was spoken by Christ in the New Testament. The initiate would then also have to recite and accept the obligations undertaken by the Perfecti, refraining from eating meat, sexual contact, and pledging to travel about ministering to the Cathar credent. It also contained, according to multiple sources, the laying on of hands, a common religious practice which in Christianity is generally used to invoke the Holy Spirit. Upon completion of the Consolamentum, the Cathar would become one of the Perfecti, obliged to don their distinctive black robes and live as an extreme ascetic for the remainder of their days. This was, of course, an exceptionally radical step which few were willing to accept. As a result, the majority of the Cathars appeared to have only performed the sacrament upon their deathbed. Peter of Vaux-de-Cernay, in his description of the Consolamentum, is amused by the fact that, as he sees it at least, many Cathars use the deathbed Consolamentum to avoid the worst excesses of a life of temporal renunciation. Indeed, they considered that however sinful a man might have been, then provided he had undergone this laying on of hands on his deathbed, and so long as he was able to recite the Lord's Prayer, he would gain salvation and consolation to the extent that he would immediately fly up to heaven without making any amends or reparations for wrongs he had committed. Beyond the Consolamentum, the Cathars did have some other sacraments. One such ritual was the Convenenza, which served as a kind of initiation ceremony into Catharism in the form of a pledge to take the Consolamentum during one's lifetime. Another was known as the Melioramentum, a kind of ceremonial confession which featured prayers, often in the presence of 100 or more other Cathars. As noted by Rainier Sacconi, the confession was a public affair and included the following recitation: "I am before God, and you to make confession, and to accuse myself of all my sins which are in me in any way, and to receive from you all pardon from God and from yourselves." It appears that by the late 12th century AD, the Cathars had become a major part of the social fabric of the Languedoc. Despite the very extreme form of asceticism that fully fledged Catharism demanded, Cathars apparently existed in very great numbers, although it seems likely that the majority of these were not Perfecti, but rather believers who had pledged to one day take the Consolamentum whilst living most of their lives in a relatively ordinary fashion, having families, eating meat, and generally participating in the world. It has even been suggested that a good number of what might be considered Cathars were not even believers who had pledged to take the Consolamentum, and therefore officially were not members of the sect. Instead, it may be that they were sympathizers, people who supported the activities of the Perfecti through provision of lodging and food, perhaps attending Cathar rituals semi-regularly. The extreme poverty of the Perfecti was notable, a spiritually prestigious act which demanded respect from the population whether they were Cathar or not. Indeed, Malcolm Barber notes that at the siege of Montségur in 1244, where one of the final roots of Cathar resistance was quashed, the soldiers defending the castle were for the most part not officially Cathars until a mass convenenza ceremony was held. It therefore seems that the Cathars, and in particular the Perfecti, were viewed with a deal of respect by their neighbours. Certainly, there appears to have been little enmity between Cathars and the wider Catholic population in the Languedoc. The way in which Cathars considered women to be spiritual equals to men was no doubt a refreshing change, to the dictates of medieval Catholicism regarding the perennial association between the fair sex and sin, and the apparent existence of houses run by female perfecti, often populated with the wives as daughters of prominent nobles and citizens, perhaps attest to this. Anti-clericalism, opposition to the excesses of the bureaucracy and opulence of the Catholic Church, was certainly very popular in the south of France during the 12th century, and would no doubt have contributed to wider support for Catharism. In any case, the Cathars were apparently fully integrated into the Languedoc by the time the Albigensian Crusade was called, much to the consternation of various Catholic preachers such as Bernard of Clairvaux. Families would no doubt have had both Cathar and Catholic members. People would have had friends and associates who were Cathar. Nobles themselves and members of their courts belonged to the sect. The knight Pons Adhema of Roudet, when questioned by a cleric regarding the heretics in his locality, responded, "We know them well." When asked why the heretics were not therefore shunned and expelled, the knight replied rather tellingly, "We cannot do that, for we were raised with them, and we have relatives among them, and we see that they lead honest and decent lives." Let me show you numbers that illustrate the penetration of Catharism into Languedoc society. Inquisitorial records from the early 13th century suggest that in some towns and villages, between 20 and 40% of the population had attended Cathar ceremonies or housed perfecti. In certain areas, the proportion was even higher. The town of Montaillou, for instance, appears to have been almost entirely Cathar or Cathar sympathetic in the late 13th century. Noble families throughout the region had Cathar members, with some estimates suggesting that up to half of the nobility in counties like Foix had Cathar connections. It is clear to see why the Catholic Church considered the Cathars to be heretics. Their denial of the Trinity, the incarnation of Christ, and the repudiation of the existence of hell and purgatory subverted Catholic orthodoxy, and in the eyes of clerical leadership represented a major threat both to the spiritual salvation of the citizens of the Languedoc and, more cynically, to the power and authority of the Catholic Church. In 1145, Bernard of Clairvaux, later Saint Bernard, upon hearing reports of the spread of heretical beliefs in the south of France, visited the Languedoc. His preaching, for which he was renowned, met with a very mixed reaction. Although successful in the city of Albi, Bernard was laughed out of a number of villages where his appeals were met with derision. He returned to his monastery in Champagne, declaring the Languedoc to be a land of heresies in need of a great deal of preaching. However, for the most part, large-scale attempts at combating the spread of the Cathar heresy through preaching in the south of France were not undertaken. By the 1160s, the Catholic Church really began to pay attention. Groups of Cathars and similar heretical groups appeared to be operating across Europe, from southern France to Germany, Italy to England. In 1163, the wildfire-like spread of heresy was discussed at the Council of Tours, and in 1165 Cathars were brought before a number of bishops at Lombes in southern France. They responded astutely to questioning and were eventually released despite being professed heretics. In 1167, the Council of Saint-Félix de Caramel, mentioned earlier, at which the Cathars formally organised their church structure in the Languedoc, further confounded Catholic clerics. Preaching missions in the 1170s, like the efforts of Bernard, were met with little success, and the 1179 Lateran Council, which had agreed that the use of force was legitimate in suppressing heresy, had done little to stem the spread of Catharism. The slow reaction of the Catholic Church could in part be attributed to more pressing matters further east. the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin's forces in 1187 and the subsequent efforts to regain the Holy City certainly took precedence over the heretics of the Languedoc. The situation changed with the election of Innocent III to the office of Pope in 1198. Highly educated and just 37 years old at his election, Innocent made the extinguishing of heresy among his highest priorities. The new pope viewed the Catholic clergy of the Languedoc as being complicit in the rise of the Cathars through their incompetence and inaction, calling them blind men, dumb dogs who can no longer bark, men who will do anything for money, zealous in avarice, lovers of gifts, seekers of rewards. Innocent's approach was threefold. He would spearhead the assault on heresy with intensive preaching in regions where heresy thrived. He would apply pressure to local lords and nobles to aid in his cause, and finally he would attack the heretics themselves. In the first instance, Innocent commissioned the Cistercian order to preach throughout the Languedoc, attempting to convince the population through words. In the second, he approached the major lords of the Languedoc with a mixture of carrot and stick. To the most powerful, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, he offered readmittance to the church. Raymond had been excommunicated in 1195, while simultaneously sending threatening and somewhat abusive letters exhorting the count to root out the heretics. In the third case, Innocent sought to repress the Cathars by force. He issued a papal bull, a kind of legal decree, equating heresy with the Roman crime of treason and subjecting heretics to the confiscation of property. In the carrying out of this strategy, 3 papal legates were dispatched: Arnaud Amaury, abbot of Citeaux, Peter of Castelnau, and a certain brother Ralph, both of the monastery of Fontfroide. This trio embarked upon a frankly disastrous campaign. In 1203, the 3 men attempted a slightly different preaching strategy than that of their predecessors, inviting the Cathars to public theological debates. A debate at Carcassonne between 13 Catholics and 13 Cathars, watched by a large crowd, ended inconclusively. Subsequent debates followed a similar course, despite the legates achieving limited success by adopting the kind of visible asceticism practiced by the Perfecti. Pressure applied to the nobles of the Languedoc yielded no results either. The issue was essentially encapsulated by the quote of the knight Pons Adhemar seen earlier. When asked why he did not root out the heretics, the Cathars were by then truly integrated into the society of the Languedoc. Add to this the fact that everyone, even the local Catholic clergy, viewed the legates as unwelcome outsiders, and it is easy to see why the mission of the 3 Cistercians failed. The final straw was an unfortunate confrontation between Peter of Castelnau and Count Raymond of Toulouse at the Count's court in 1208, which saw the nobleman excommunicated on the spot for his refusal to persecute the heretics. For his action, Peter was murdered on his return journey to Rome by unknown assailants. This violent episode was the final straw for Innocent, who turned to the third part of his strategy: violent repression. Incensed by the brazen murder of a papal legate, Pope Innocent called for a crusade against the Cathars of the Languedoc and their sympathizers in March 1209. For the remainder of the year, the crusade was preached throughout Christendom and in particular northern France. Although neither the King of France, Philip Augustus, nor his son could be recruited, Innocent and his legates did succeed in bringing together a host of noblemen with the promise of the usual crusade indulgences: forgiveness of sins and the right to land confiscated from the heretics and their supporters. With a threat of armed invasion looming large, the lords of the Languedoc scrambled to come to terms with the Pope. Raymond VI of Toulouse agreed to embark upon an embarrassing public penance, which included swearing allegiance to the Church and forfeiture of 7 of his castles. Raymond Roger Trencavel, Viscount of Carcassonne, Albi and Béziers, some of the greatest hotbeds of Cathar activity, was not so lucky. His request to join the crusade was turned down. It was Trencavel's lands which therefore became the first target of the Crusaders. On the 21st of July 1209, the Crusaders, led by the papal legate Arnaud Amaury, reached Béziers, which stands atop a bluff overlooking the Orbe River. Attempting to avoid the slaughter which accompanied most medieval sieges, the city's bishop attempted to negotiate with the besiegers, who offered to spare Béziers if the population handed over all of the heretics. The citizens of Béziers refused outright. The majority also refused to leave the city when the Crusaders appealed for all faithful Catholics to abandon Béziers before it was attacked the following day. As the Crusaders began preparations for a lengthy siege, a detachment of the city's defenders sallied out from Béziers. Shortly thereafter, a skirmish began between these defenders and a group of Crusaders. Exactly what happened next is unclear. However, what we do know is that a number of Crusaders gained control of one of the city's gates. Suddenly presented with a marvellous opportunity, the entire crusading army was set loose, pouring into the streets of Béziers. The city was subjected to a vicious sack. The Crusaders broke into houses, looting and killing at will as the inhabitants of Béziers fled to the city's churches for refuge amongst the panicked ringing of church bells. Crammed into Béziers Cathedral, the Church of St. Jude and the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, the population of the city presented a dilemma to the Crusaders. Which amongst them were Catholics and which were heretics? Appealing to Arnaud Amaury, the soldiers asked what they should do. The abbot's reply was chilling. Kill them all, for the Lord knoweth them that are his. Amaury himself estimated that 20,000 people were put to the sword, although more conservative estimates place the number at somewhere around 7,000. In Amaury's own words, our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex, or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt as divine vengeance miraculously raged against it. Let me show you numbers that reveal the scale of this atrocity. The population of Béziers in 1209 is estimated to have been between 15,000 and 20,000 people. If we accept the lower casualty estimate of 7,000, this represents approximately 35 to 47% of the city's population killed in a single day. The higher estimate of 20,000 would mean virtually the entire population was massacred. Archaeological excavations in Béziers have uncovered mass graves from this period, containing hundreds of bodies, many showing signs of violent death. Such was the brutality wrought at Béziers that even staunch supporters of the Crusade, such as Peter of Les Vaux de Cernay, felt the need to explain it away by blaming the mercenary contingent of the crusading army. News of the massacre at Béziers spread like wildfire. The first cruel act of the Crusaders in the Languedoc caused widespread dismay, with many towns and castles submitting to the Crusaders rather than suffer the same fate. However, it also had the consequence of causing the population of the Languedoc, both Cathar and Catholic alike, to despise the crusading forces. Narbonne fell without a fight, and Amaury's forces reached Carcassonne, still held by Raymond Roger Trencavel, by the 1st of August 1209. Lacking water, the garrison did not last long. Raymond Roger negotiated a settlement which allowed the entire population of the city, Catholic and Cathar alike, to leave unharmed, albeit without their possessions. On the 15th of August, a relatively minor noble by the name of Simon de Montfort was chosen to replace the dispossessed Trencavel as Lord of Carcassonne. De Montfort would later rise to prominence amongst the Crusader leaders, perpetrating some of the conflict's most heinous atrocities. After their initial success, the Albigensian Crusaders faced more concerted opposition from the lords of the Languedoc, opposition that would continue throughout the Albigensian Crusade until its conclusion with the Treaty of Paris in 1229. The fortunes of both the southern lords and the Crusaders ebbed and flowed as towns and castles were taken by the Crusaders, recaptured, and then taken again. The brutality that had begun with the horrific events at Béziers continued throughout the conflict. At the conclusion of the siege of Minerve in July 1210, the first mass burning of Cathars was carried out. 140 Perfecti were burned in the valley below the town. It would not be the last time that such a punishment was meted out. An entire exploration could be dedicated to covering the military manoeuvres of the Albigensian Crusade. From 1210 to 1213, de Montfort conducted a campaign of terror in the Languedoc, sacking castles and towns, burning hundreds of Cathar Perfecti, and crucially amassing enormous political power for himself. After defeating Peter II of Aragon, who claimed lordship over the Languedoc at the Battle of Muret on the 12th of September 1213, de Montfort effectively established control over the region. His universally unpopular reign came to an end in June 1218, when his head was unceremoniously obliterated by a catapult-launched stone propelled from the walls of Toulouse which he was besieging. The accounts of de Montfort's death are remarkably detailed. According to the Song of the Cathar Wars, a contemporary chronicle sympathetic to the Languedoc, the stone that killed de Montfort was operated by a team including women and girls. The chronicler presents this as divine justice, noting that de Montfort, who had killed so many innocents, was himself killed by those he considered weak and inconsequential. The crusade dragged on until 1229 and was only ended by the intervention of the French crown. Louis VIII and his son Louis IX, or rather his regent mother Blanche of Castile, effectively ended the conflict by employing a brutal scorched earth policy which ensured the final surrender of the lords of the Languedoc. Despite the burnings and brutality of the crusade, Catharism apparently remained strong throughout the south of France, as many of the Perfecti retreated to more remote locations such as the hilltop strongholds of Montségur and Quéribus. Innocent III did not get to witness the end of the violence he had begun, as he died in 1216. Pope Gregory IX, realizing a more precise approach than full-blown military invasion would be required to uproot the Cathars, set in motion an institution that would grow to instill fear across the Languedoc and beyond, the Inquisition. Inquisitors were appointed in Albi, Toulouse and Carcassonne, tasked with seeking out and eliminating heretics. Upon entering a town or village, the inquisitors would deliver a sermon and extract from their audience a profession of faith and an oath against heresy. The population were encouraged to inform on fellow citizens whom they suspected of heresy. Being a perfect was of course considered heresy, as was sheltering or aiding a perfect, witnessing a consolamentum, and failing to report a heretic. Even the dead were not spared from accusation. Once discovered, Cathars were subjected to intensive questioning as the inquisitors attempted to extract as many names of other suspects as possible, Inquisitors had the power to search property at will, and people on their deathbed were watched with increased suspicion, lest they take the Consolamentum. Cathars who voluntarily confessed and promised to renounce their beliefs were resettled in areas with no known heretics, and forced to wear clothing affixed with 2 yellow crosses. Those who were not so forthcoming with a confession and the unrepentant suffered the gruesome fate of being burnt at the stake. The work of the Inquisition in the Languedoc fostered an atmosphere of paranoid fear. Overzealous inquisitors were equally liable to persecute falsely accused Catholics as well as Cathars, and unsurprisingly were thoroughly despised by the population. Reprisals were common. In Toulouse, a mob pelted the inquisitors with stones, and in Corday 2 inquisitors and their assistants were thrown down a well to their deaths. Constantly hounded in the decade following the establishment of the Inquisition in the Languedoc, the Cathars began to slowly dwindle in number under the weight of persecution. In May 1243, an army gathered to besiege the fortress of Massacre, widely known to be a hotbed of heresy and the refuge of a large number of Perfecti. The Cathar bishop of Toulouse had even established his court there during the Albigensian Crusade. Despite possessing a garrison of just 98 knights, assault against such a heavily fortified hilltop castle was fraught with difficulty. The old strategy of outlasting the defenders was employed, and in March 1244 the garrison surrendered. The inhabitants were allowed to go free after a thorough quizzing by the inquisitors. The 200 Perfecti within Massacre were not willing to renounce their faith, and so were condemned to the flames with which the inquisitors had so cruelly expunged the Languedoc of its Cathars. 21 of the castle's inhabitants chose to take the Consolamentum, and so too were burned. The site of this execution, known as the Field of the Cremated, is today marked by a memorial. The Inquisition after Massacre was carried out with even more extreme prejudice. Sean Martin compared the trials, betrayals, and insidious investigations with the purges of Stalinist Russia. With the fall of Massacre in 1244 and the last hilltop stronghold of Caribus in 1255, the Cathars lost their final places of refuge. Deprived of safety, Catharism endured for some decades in a clandestine form, largely thanks to the deep roots it had put down in the Languedoc. A brief revival led by Cathar Prefect Pierre Autier was ended when Autier was executed in April 1310, and the last known Cathar Prefect in the Languedoc, Guillaume Bellibaste, was executed in the autumn of 1321 in the small town of Villarouge-Termenès. By the end of the year 1330, it appears that the near-constant persecution of the Inquisition had effectively ended Catharism in the Languedoc. All remaining believers had been forced to recant. The Perfecti had been eliminated. The number of legal proceedings against Cathars in the 1330s dropped dramatically. Once a staple of the fabric of social and religious life in the south of France, the bonshommes and bonnes femmes were no more.